In a distant age, when castles rose upon the hills and kings sat upon thrones of gold, their lives were not only filled with battles and decisions. There was another time, a silent time unrecorded in the chronicles of war, a time of leisure. In those hours, the king would set aside his sword, forget the crown upon his head, and sit as an ordinary man searching for a moment of rest. He might listen to gentle music, gaze at the sky through a stone window, or lose himself between the pages of a book. Leisure revealed another face of kings, a face no one knew, yet one that always lingered behind the cold walls of palaces. Inside those palaces, beneath heavy chandeliers hanging over thrones of gold and silk, kings were not always surrounded by war and grave decisions. There was also that silent time behind closed doors, known as moments of leisure. These hours were not merely fleeting breaks in a crowded schedule, but spaces where a king drifted between simple humanity and the burden of his mighty crown. For some, leisure was a kind of sanctuary, a retreat away from crowds, envoys, and ministers, a brief island of stillness in a sea of noise. We can imagine the king sitting before a blazing fireplace, listening to the crackling of wood, the crown set aside, the heavy robe removed. In that moment, he was not a monarch, but a man chasing a thought or a memory. Some kings preferred small, dim chambers, hidden from the eyes of the court. They would study the ornamented walls or watch shadows dance with candlelight. This silence was not empty. It was crowded with their thoughts, their dreams, and sometimes their fears of tomorrow. The night deepened this mood. When voices faded and the court slept, the king would remain awake, writing a letter in his own hand to a distant ally, or reading a book brought from foreign lands, or staring at an hourglass as the grains slipped away, reminding him that time waits for no one, not even kings. In some palaces, there were secret rooms where only the king himself could enter, sanctuaries where he might regain his true self, away from the watchful eyes that followed him everywhere. It is fascinating to imagine how kings looked upon their own leisure. For some it was bodily rest, lying on high beds wrapped in silk and cotton, listening to the sound of the wind against the windows. For others, leisure was a chance for thought, for planning tomorrow, battles, or solving the puzzles of politics. Whatever their view, leisure was always silent and precious, shared only between the king and himself. And in the end we see that behind closed doors there were not always secrets, but simple human moments. Thus, while we close this quiet chapter, we open the door to the next, where kings left their cold halls and rode into forests and fields, finding leisure on horseback and under the wings of falcons, in a world known as the hunt. Beyond the stone walls and golden halls, kings often sought another kind of leisure, one found in the untamed embrace of nature. The hunt was not merely a pastime. It was a symbol of power, courage, and mastery over both land and beast. In the early morning, when mist still clung to the fields and forests, the king would ride out with his nobles, his falcons perched upon gloved hands, his hounds eager and restless at his side. The forest, vast and shadowed, became a stage where leisure and danger intertwined. Every rustle in the leaves, every crack of a branch, could be the approach of prey or a reminder of lurking peril. Yet, for the king, the thrill of the chase was as important as the catch. To ride swiftly through woods, to test his strength and skill against nature, gave him a sense of freedom unknown within palace walls. The hunt also carried ceremony. Trumpets echoed, banners fluttered, and servants followed with provisions and weapons. Each arrow loosed, each falcon released, became not only a pursuit of quarry, but a demonstration of discipline and order. And when the king struck down a stag or captured a falcon's prize, it was not simply meat for the table. It was proof of his dominion, an earthly echo of his crown. But leisure in the wild was more than sport. It was communion with the earth itself. Beneath tall trees, among rivers and hills, the king could breathe deeply, unguarded, as though nature whispered secrets that courtiers never dared to speak. The hunt was both escape and reminder, that even kings are but men, and that in the vastness of the forest, crown and peasant alike were subject to the will of nature. When the horns of the hunt grew silent and the horses returned to their stables, another world of leisure awaited within the castle halls, a world of feasts and banquets. These were not simple meals, but living theatres where wealth, power, and culture met at a single table. The great hall would be lit by hundreds of torches and chandeliers, their flames reflected upon polished silver and gilded goblets. Long tables stretched from end to end, covered with embroidered cloths and piled high with delicacies that only a king's kitchen could prepare. Roasted swan and pheasant venison, fresh from the hunt bread baked with spices from distant lands and goblets brimming with wine carried across seas. Yet food was only part of the spectacle. Music filled the air, lutes, harps, and drums weaving melodies that mingled with the laughter of courtiers. Jugglers, poets, and minstrels performed between courses, while nobles exchanged whispers of politics and alliances beneath the cover of merriment. For in the banquet hall, the king did not only feed his guests. He displayed his wealth, confirmed his power, and reminded all present that the crown was the center of abundance. Banquets also carried deep symbolism. The seating itself was a map of rank and loyalty. The closer one sat to the king, the greater one's honor. Toasts were raised not only to health and fortune, but to victories, treaties, and the enduring might of the realm. And when the final course arrived, often a grand spectacle of sugar fruit, or even a sculpted cake shaped like a fortress or a crown, it was both a feast for the body and a display of artistic wonder. For the king, leisure at the banquet table was more than indulgence. It was a stage where he played many roles at once: host, ruler, father of his people, and keeper of tradition. Between goblets of wine and notes of music, he lived not only as a man among men, but as a symbol of a kingdom, its glory. When the echoes of the banquet faded and the hall grew quiet, kings often turned to quieter forms of leisure, games and pastimes that sharpened the mind as much as they pleased the spirit. These moments, though small compared to the grandeur of hunts and feasts, revealed much about the private life of royalty. Chess was among the most cherished diversions. Upon a board of carved wood and ivory pieces, kings found a reflection of their own world: strategy, power, risk, and sacrifice. Each move was a miniature war, fought not with swords but with thought, and victory on the chessboard brought the same satisfaction as triumph on the battlefield. Dice cards and other games of chance also filled the evenings, though they carried whispers of fortune's fickleness, a reminder that even a king could win or lose in the blink of an eye. Music and poetry offered another escape. Minstrels strummed soft notes while the king listened, lost in ballads of heroes and lovers. Sometimes he himself might compose verses, etching words upon parchment by candlelight, leaving behind not decrees, but fragments of the heart. Storytelling, too, was a favored pastime. Tales of distant lands, ancient legends, and whispered myths that blurred the line between truth and imagination. In these games and arts, the king was no longer a figure of law and command, but a participant in the universal joys of mankind. For in laughter shared over dice, in the hush of a room listening to song, or in the thoughtful silence of a chess match, royalty found leisure not in wealth or ceremony, but in the simple pleasures that outlived crowns and kingdoms alike. Beyond the banquet halls and chambers of stone, kings sought another form of leisure, one found not in gold or music, but in the quiet whisper of leaves and the gentle murmur of fountains. The royal gardens were more than cultivated land. They were sanctuaries where power gave way to peace, and the burden of crowns melted into the rhythm of nature. In these gardens, paths wound between groves of rare trees, brought from distant kingdoms as living treasures. Roses of deep crimson, lilies of silver white, and herbs of healing fragrance lined the walkways, filling the air with perfume. Marble fountains poured endlessly, their waters catching sunlight like liquid crystal, while birds sang from gilded cages or from the branches themselves. Here, the king could walk slowly, unguarded, his hand brushing against the leaves, his thoughts wandering far from politics and war. Sometimes he would sit by a reflecting pool, watching the still surface break into ripples, as though it were a mirror to his own restless mind. At other times, he would gather with his family beneath shaded pavilions, sharing fruit, laughter, and the rare warmth of a life unchained from ceremony. The garden was not only beauty, but also symbol, a miniature kingdom in harmony, where order was drawn from nature's wildness, just as the crown sought to bring order to men. To plant a tree was to leave a mark that would outlive its planter, a reminder that even kings sowed seeds whose fruits they might never taste. In these walks under the open sky, the king discovered that leisure was not always loud with music or feasts, but often silent, gentle, and eternal, carried in the fragrance of blossoms and the flight of a bird. Amid the noise of courts and the weight of crowns, kings often sought a different kind of leisure. One, not of the body, but of the soul. Within chapels lit by flickering candles and perfumed with incense, they laid aside the armor of power and stood humbled before the eternal. In the silence of prayer, a king was no longer a sovereign, but a servant, a man searching for forgiveness, guidance, or peace. Kneeling upon stone floors, he whispered words not meant for courtiers or scribes, but for the unseen. Sometimes he prayed for victory in war, sometimes for the safety of his family, and often for the strength to carry the burdens of rule. Spiritual leisure was not always found in solemn ritual. It also lived in the reading of sacred texts, in meditation before holy relics, or in the simple act of listening to hymns echoing through vaulted ceilings. These moments lifted the king beyond the walls of his palace, reminding him that his throne was but temporary, while the heavens stretched into eternity. Faith gave kings a different measure of time, one not counted in battles or reigns, but in the salvation of the soul. And though crowns glittered and palaces shone, the quiet hours spent in devotion often revealed a truth greater than power, that even the mightiest ruler was but dust before God. Thus, in prayer and reflection, kings found a leisure deeper than rest, a stillness that reminded them of their place in the vast order of existence and of the fragile humanity hidden beneath the robes of majesty. Beyond the battlefield, beyond the council chambers and banquet halls, many kings discovered leisure in creation itself. For some, this meant the stroke of a brush upon canvas, the chisel against stone, or the pen across parchment. These moments of craft revealed another face of royalty, not as rulers of men, but as seekers of beauty and knowledge. Some kings took pleasure in painting, capturing not only faces and landscapes, but fragments of their inner worlds. Others found joy in music, plucking the strings of a lute, or composing melodies that carried their unspoken thoughts. In these acts, they were no longer monarchs, but artists, vulnerable, expressive, and profoundly human. Collecting, too, became a royal pastime. Libraries filled with scrolls and manuscripts, cabinets of rare stones and strange devices, galleries lined with treasures from distant voyages, all stood as proof of a mind curious about the world beyond its borders. To gather was to preserve, and to preserve was to defy the silence of time. Science and invention often drew the attention of rulers with restless intellects. They studied the stars through polished lenses, experimented with metals and alchemy, or sought hidden laws in the turning of wheels and the flow of water. In their hands, leisure became discovery, and discovery became another form of legacy. These hobbies were more than diversions. They were bridges between the crown and eternity, marks left not through wars or decrees, but through art, knowledge, and wonder. In every painted figure, every written verse, every collected relic, a king carved out a leisure that would endure long after his throne had turned to dust. Behind the iron weight of crowns and the stern image carved into chronicles, kings carried hearts that longed for closeness. Love, in all its forms, was both a comfort and a burden within royal life. It shaped alliances, inspired acts of devotion, and sometimes ignited storms that shook entire realms. For some rulers, love was bound to politics. Marriages were forged not only from affection, but from necessity, unions that bound kingdoms together, sealed treaties, and quieted conflicts. Yet even within these strategic bonds, tenderness could blossom. Letters written in trembling ink, gifts of jewels or roses brought from distant lands, and whispered vows beneath candlelight revealed that kings, too, sought the warmth of human affection. But not all royal romances were peaceful. At times, jealousy and rivalry stirred within palace walls. Queens and courtesans, nobles and companions, each could hold the king's heart and with it, the envy or suspicion of others. These passions, hidden or displayed, often shaped the undercurrents of power in ways unseen by armies or councils. Love also revealed itself in gestures of grandeur. Some monarchs built entire gardens, fountains, and palaces for the sake of one beloved, monuments not to victory, but to longing. In these walls of marble and arches of gold, one could read not the story of conquest, but of devotion. Yet beyond desire, there was also companionship, the simple comfort of sharing a walk in a garden, listening to music together, or confiding secrets in a trusted confidant. These were the rarest treasures of all, for they gave the king what no crown could: the sense of being seen not as a ruler, but as a man. Thus, love and companionship stood as reminders that even in the highest seats of power, the human heart remained unchanged. Its joys and sorrows could not be silenced by armies, nor softened by riches. Love, in the end, was the one dominion that ruled kings as surely as they ruled their lands. At the heart of history lies a truth often overlooked: a king's leisure was never empty. These moments of stillness, whether in hunting grounds, banquet halls, gardens, or chapels, revealed more than the pomp of ceremony or the roar of battle. They uncovered the inner lives of rulers, the fragile balance between their humanity and their crowns. Some monarchs turned their free hours into sanctuaries of wisdom. They read rare manuscripts, studied philosophy, or contemplated the divine, seeking strength not from armies, but from knowledge and faith. These kings left behind legacies of vision and reform, remembered as wise guardians who shaped their realms with foresight. Others, however, surrendered their leisure to indulgence. They feasted without restraint, gambled fortunes on chance, or lost themselves in fleeting passions. For them, time away from rule weakened the throne, leaving their names to fade into whispers of excess and folly. Leisure, then, was a test, a quiet judgment that history passed not in the clash of swords but in the silence between them. It revealed who a king truly was, when no courtier watched, and no decree was needed. Was he a seeker of wisdom or a prisoner of desire, a builder of legacies or a captive of vanity? From the 11th to the 15th century, each ruler answered this question in his own way. Some earned immortality, their deeds etched into chronicles as leaders of both strength and vision. Others vanished, remembered only for the shadows of their indulgence. In the end, crowns may have lifted men to thrones, but it was leisure, those hidden hours of choice and reflection, that revealed the truth of the king within.